Hi, my name is Miguel Menchaca, and today I'm going to be presenting my research project on consciousness in AI. So, some important background information before we get into the meat of my argument. In terms of consciousness, consciousness is a heavily debated topic in science, and that's something we'll discuss more later. But for the purposes of this paper, I define consciousness as being a being with which possesses both sentience and self-awareness. So what do I mean by that? Well, when I say sentience, I mean what I define sentience as is the ability to take information about one's environment and respond to that information. And self-awareness, what I mean by self-awareness is the understanding of one's own existence. So AI is a pretty broad term when it comes to computing, but it generally is defined as any device that perceives its environment and takes some sort of action as a result of those perceptions. So some good examples would be like Google search engine, which takes in information about what is most relevant to a particular search, or Siri, which is absorbs data from a server and the user to determine what the appropriate action to take is. Now there's many types of AI, but one of the main ones discussed in this presentation is learning AI, which are AI created to learn information in order to complete a certain task. So both Google and Siri are learning AI, as well as chatbots like Cleverbot, which are learning AI created with the purpose of imitating human responses. So, in terms of the literature review, I primarily utilize academic peer-reviewed journals in the making of this research presentation, and the two main journals that I used were Machine Consciousness and Artificial Thought, which was created by Andrew Fingelkirtz, that guy right there, and what he did was he outlined a theory on how consciousness might be implemented in a computer, and he also provided a lot of examples of failed attempts of making a conscious AI and how his personal idea differed from those past attempts. And secondly was the article Artificial Consciousness and the Consciousness Attention Dissociation by Harry Halagian. That guy right there. And so Halagian provided a diverging point of view on AI that AI will never be conscious, and he provided a lot of counter arguments against the possible existence of a conscious AI. And so my research question was, can a conscious AI be created? As in, will it ever be possible for a conscious AI to exist? And so the primary method that I used for my research was using academic searches such as EBSCOhost. Primarily I used EBSCOhost. And primarily I used the database PsycInfo for my information, and so this gave me a lot of peer-reviewed articles that were super helpful in creating my research. And then secondarily, I used Google a little bit to find certain information on certain aspects of AI and also of consciousness. And so my research findings. So in this particular topic, I'd say it was a little difficult to find numbers or graphs, as this is more of a conceptual sort of topic. So I won't be presenting any sort of graphs. I'll have some images, but I don't have any data per se to put up because we're not dealing with data in particular in this current assignment. And so through my research of consciousness first, I first wanted to research the origins of consciousness, as if we understand the origins of consciousness, we can then apply that to AI and say, if this is the origin of consciousness in humans, then why not just create this origin of consciousness in AI? And so this actually caused a few issues because scientists generally disagree about the origins of consciousness. So there's a lot of theories, but basically the issue is that scientists don't currently understand how it is that we get from small beings, micro beings, to a more sort of macro consciousness. How do we get from a neuron to consciousness in a human being? I mean, obviously there's more neurons that contribute to the consciousness of a human being, but scientists aren't really sure how it is that these neurons connect in order to create consciousness in a human being. So there's a few different theories. One theory is that there is a causal structure where our brain is evolutionarily adapted so that we have consciousness in order to understand what objects around us are going to cause to happen to us. So this is the idea that everything we see, we only see because it has a cause and effect on us, which is why we can't see air. It has no cause and effect on us. Or is why we can see a table, because when we touch the table, we'll feel it and we'll bump into it. So the reason we need to see the table is that it causes an effect on us. And so this theory says that evolutionarily we adapted so that only these causal structures are what we see, and that's the sort of origin of consciousness, is us being able to understand what is going on around us and how it's going to cause effects on us. Another different theory is that so it's a sort of resonance theory where in every object there's a certain amount of electromagnetic pulse that resonates within the object, and this also applies to brains in humans. And so the theory is that neurons in the brains of humans share an electromagnetic field, and then they use that to communicate in order to create this sort of macro consciousness, this overarching consciousness to the micro consciousness of the neurons. And that's what leads to consciousness, is this sort of overarching electromagnetic pulsation of neurons versus just the regular firing of neurons. Now, there's issues with both of these. So an issue that's oftentimes discussed about both of these theories is that in humans, when we go to sleep or when we're knocked unconscious, we're unconscious, and yet these operations, these things that these theories are saying cause consciousness, are still happening in our minds. So how is it that we can explain that we're unconscious while the things that make us conscious are still operating in our minds? And this is not something that scientists yet have an answer. They can't exactly say why it is that when we're sleeping, our brain is still working the parts of the brain that lead to consciousness. And so basically, in summary, scientists understand and can classify when something is conscious, but they don't know exactly how it gets there. So what does this mean for the AI part of it? So it seems that because we can't say that we know the cause of consciousness, we can't just program the cause of consciousness into an AI, so we have to look to other alternative methods. And so one of the leading theories of how consciousness could be created in an AI is that consciousness in an AI would self-emerge if the AI replicates what causes consciousness in humans. So that's a little complicated. Let me explain a little better. So basically the theory is that if instead of imitating consciousness, like having a computer that learns what proper human responses are, or learns what it is that a conscious human being, how they would react in a certain situation, instead of doing that, you create the building blocks of the brain, such as, I don't know, the hippocampus, the different parts of the brain, and you implant them in a computer, and then theoretically, if all of the parts of the brain are in the computer should then achieve consciousness itself. Now, to talk a little bit more about the imitations of consciousness that are present in robots, this actually does not count as consciousness, because consciousness requires self-awareness, as I explained earlier. And if a robot is created that imitates humans but does not actually create the consciousness itself, but rather just imitates the consciousness, then it's not self-aware even if it acts to be so. So a great example is this robot here. So this robot here imitates human responses and may even look human, but because it's just imitating, it's just simulating what a human would do, it's not conscious, because it doesn't have consciousness at its most foundational level. And so the way in which we could implant consciousness is by creating an imitation of a brain, like I explained earlier. And that would be the real way to achieve consciousness, because then it would come out itself instead of being imitated by the computer. So from this information, we can conclude that consciousness is achievable by AI, but it is only really theoretical at the time being. So right now we don't have a brain inside a computer like I explained, or something along those lines. Right now we only really have the learning AIs, which can imitate human responses but aren't conscious themselves. They're just imitating human responses. And we have we know that a conscious AI can't just like I said, can't just imitate a conscious being. It has to become conscious itself. And then we know that we're thinking that a possible way to create a conscious AI is to imitate a human brain within a computer, like I said. Now, immediately, there's a few counter arguments to this idea that the human brain, like imitating the human brain within a computer, could create a conscious being. And so one of the main ones is that a human brain is constantly changing. A human brain is constantly forming new neural pathways. Its gray matter of the brain is changing. The brain's always changing. It's adapting. It's growing. It's getting rid of old memories that aren't necessary. It's always changing. And so one of the main counterpoints to the idea that a brain within a computer would be conscious is that it's not the same as a human brain if it's not forming new connections, because it can only just be a brain at any given moment. It can't be a constantly changing brain. And so actually, to answer that counter argument, there is a point that I have about anterograde amnesiacs. So people with anterograde amnesia, what happens to them is some sort of accident happens and their brain is damaged, and it happens one way or another, but eventually they're unable to form new memories. So these people can't form new memories, they can't learn new things, they can't do that anything new really, but they still have their old memories, they still have their long-term memories from before their accident or whatever it is that happened to them. And so I the point I want to make is that a brain created in a computer would be like an anterograde amnesiac. It still has all the formations that are programmed into it. It doesn't form new ones, but it's still conscious. It's still like a human being. It's still conscious because it still has the neural pathways necessary for consciousness. It just can't form new ones. And so future research. So future research is definitely needed in this field as it's largely unexplored. It was a little difficult for me to find papers about this particular subject. There was 2 or 3 main ones, but really after that it was just there was nothing else. It was just those 2 or 3 papers about this particular subject, as there's not many people who discuss AI consciousness. Really, what people mostly focus on these days is AI in its applicability to like business, or in its applicability to search engines, or whatever its field that it needs to be applied to. Nobody seeks to create a conscious AI. They just want to create AI that serve a purpose. And so one thing that we need to do is we need to test the brain imitation like sort of model of AI. This has never been tested, and we're not sure whether if we're just imitating parts of the brain if it will work, or if we have to imitate neurons at the most base level, or all sorts of different things. Nobody really understands yet how this would be implemented, so it needs to be tried to be implemented. It hasn't been tried yet. And then finally, we need to form some more alternative theories about how to create consciousness in AI. There's a lot of different there's a couple different theories at the moment, but there also could be more theories as to how to create consciousness in AI. And we need to examine the pre-existing theories and see whether they are still as valid as we once thought.